The Alpha's brother rejected her in public. Then the king claimed her as his Luna. Chapter 1. You were never meant for him. Those words did not make sense yet, not while Alesha was still on the floor. The stone was cold against her palms. She could feel every rough edge of it, every crack, the way the chill moved straight through her skin and settled in her chest like it belonged there. The torchlight above her swayed. The pack's laughter bounced off the ceremonial hall walls and found her from every direction at once. She did not move, not because she could not, but because getting up felt like admitting the fall was real. And she was not ready for that yet. She pressed her fingers flat against the stone and made herself breathe. Earlier that afternoon, she had been perfectly fine. That was the thing nobody would ever understand about Alesha. She was always perfectly fine, right up until she was not. She had spent the morning in the archive the way she spent every morning, tucked between shelves that reached the ceiling, her fingers trailing the spines of manuscripts older than the pack's founding stones. Dust floated in the pale window light. The room smelled like aged paper, dry cedar, and the faint oil her father used to condition the older bindings. It was her favorite smell in the world. It meant she was somewhere she was needed. She had been cataloging a set of ancient battle manuscripts, records of territorial wars from 3 generations back. Nobody cared about these. Nobody read them. But Alesha had been cross-referencing troop formations from the Western Ridge campaign against weather patterns recorded in the lunar almanac beside it, and she had found something. A pattern. A strategic error the old commanders kept repeating, war after war, because no one had ever laid the 2 documents side by side long enough to see it. She almost wrote a note to the council about it. Then she remembered the council did not take notes from archivists' daughters, who could not shift into anything worth fearing. She closed the manuscript instead and moved on to the next one. That was Alesha's life. Sharp mind, quiet mouth, empty hands where her wolf's magic should have been. In the Crimson Crest pack, elemental aura was everything. It was how you were ranked, how you were valued, how you were seen. Fire wolves rose to generals. Earth wolves became council elders. Storm wolves married into noble houses. Your aura was your proof that you mattered. Alesha's wolf had no aura. She had checked as a child 100 times. She had stood barefoot in the grass on full moon nights with her eyes squeezed shut, waiting to feel something crackle or bloom or rise from her hands. Nothing ever came. Her wolf existed, she could feel her faintly, the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue that never quite arrives. But there was no power attached to her. No element, no signature, just silence. Her father told her silence was its own kind of gift. The pack told her she was broken. She had learned to live somewhere in between. She was organizing the last manuscript shelf when she heard the footsteps in the hall, the specific cadence of expensive boots on stone, unhurried and deliberate. She knew that sound before she turned around. She had memorized it the way you memorize a song you never meant to love. Lady Bianca appeared in the archive doorway with 2 noble girls flanking her like ornaments. All 3 of them dressed for the ceremony that evening in deep jewel colors that made Alesha suddenly aware. She was wearing ink-stained work clothes and had a smudge of something on her left wrist she had not noticed until right now. Bianca looked at her the way people look at something mildly unpleasant on the bottom of their shoe. Curious, briefly, then dismissive. "Still in here," Bianca said. It was not a question. Her voice was smooth and sweet the way certain poisons are sweet, designed to go down easy before they do their damage. "I honestly thought you might skip the ceremony tonight. Save yourself the embarrassment." One of the girls behind her stifled a laugh. Alesha kept her hands on the shelf. She did not look away from Bianca, because looking away was the version of herself she was trying to stop being. "I have as much right to attend as anyone." Bianca smiled. "Of course you do. Even the archives let in things with no real value." She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they want their cruelty to seem like concern. "Prince Matteo will be choosing tonight, Alesha. A true mate. Someone who can stand beside him. Someone the pack can look at and feel proud." The pause she left after that was surgical. "Just wanted to make sure you had realistic expectations for the evening." She left before Alesha could answer. Her perfume lingered, something floral and expensive that turned Alesha's stomach long after the footsteps faded. Alesha stood in the quiet of the archive for a long moment. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were dry. She pressed the heel of her hand briefly to her sternum, where something had lodged itself like a splinter, and then she exhaled slowly and went back to organizing the shelf. She went to the ceremony anyway. She wore her best dress, a deep cream color that her mother had hemmed for her 2 winters ago, before her mother stopped being something Alesha let herself think about too directly. She braided her hair the way she always did for formal pack gatherings, neat and low at the back of her neck. She did not add anything extra. She did not know how to be the kind of woman who added extra things and had them land right. The ceremonial hall was enormous and already full when she arrived. Torches lined every wall in iron brackets, and the fire from them threw moving gold light across the assembled pack. Nobles in the front rows on tiered benches, lesser-ranked wolves filling the space behind them. Everyone arranged according to a hierarchy so deeply embedded that people took their places without being told. Alesha found her spot near the outer edge of the room, close enough to see, far enough back that no one would have to acknowledge her presence. The sacred mating circle was laid into the center of the stone floor, a wide ring carved in symbols she had actually translated once, in a manuscript most people assumed was decorative. They were not decorative. They were binding words, old ones, the kind that meant what they said and did not let go. She looked at that circle and let herself hope, just for a moment, just once more. Because Mateo had smiled at her 3 weeks ago in the corridor outside the East Wing. A real smile, not a polite one. He had stopped walking when he saw her, and he had asked her what she was reading, and they had stood there for 6 whole minutes talking about navigational charts from the Northern Territories, and he had laughed, actually laughed, at something she said. She had carried that 6 minutes with her like something fragile and irreplaceable. She carried it into the ceremony hall. She carried it right up until the moment Mateo stepped into the sacred circle, and his eyes found hers across the room, and she thought, this is it, this is the moment, this is. He looked away. Deliberately, completely, like she was a corner of the room and not a person standing in it. The ceremony elder spoke the formal words. The torches seemed to burn brighter. The pack leaned forward collectively, anticipatory and electric. And then Mateo's voice rang out across the hall, clear and carrying, aimed directly at her with a precision that could only have been intentional. I would never accept someone as weak as you. He said it like a verdict, like something long decided that he was only now getting around to announcing. And then he stepped forward and placed one hand flat against her shoulder and shoved, not violently, but with enough force that she stumbled backward out of the sacred circle and hit the stone floor with her palms and one knee. The hall erupted. Not all of it in laughter, some of it in gasps, some of it in the particular thick silence of people witnessing something they know is wrong but will not say so out loud. But enough of it in laughter that the sound filled the room and bounced off the stone ceiling and came down on Alesha from every direction at once. She stayed on the floor, not because she could not get up. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone and made herself breathe and told herself she was not going to cry in this room, in front of these people, in this dress that her mother had hemmed for her. She was not going to give them that. She was not going to give him that. The torches guttered. Every single one of them, at the same moment, like something in the room had exhaled. The laughter died first, then the murmuring, then everything. A shadow moved across the ceiling, slow and deliberate. The way smoke moves when it is not in any hurry, when it knows it has already won. Alesha felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. She felt it in her palms against the stone. She felt it in the air on the back of her neck. She looked up. King Giovanni had risen from his throne. She had never seen him stand before, not like this, not with intention behind it. He was taller than she remembered from the formal portraits, broader, and the shadow flames that clung to his hands and forearms like living things were darker than she had been prepared for. The manuscripts she had read described them as volatile, uncontrollable, the kind of power that made trained warriors step back without deciding to. She understood that now in a way she had not understood it from a page. Every person in the hall had gone completely still. He descended the dais one step at a time. The crowd parted ahead of him without a word spoken, just a collective, involuntary movement away from something too large and too old to argue with. His shadow flames did not flare. They moved with him, quiet and enormous, like a tide that knew exactly where it was going. He stopped in front of her. Alessia was still on the floor. She looked up at him from there and did not look away, because looking away was the version of herself she was trying to stop being. His eyes were dark and entirely steady. He did not look at the pack. He did not look at Matteo. He looked only at her, with an expression she could not name, not pity, not performance, not the bright, calculated warmth of a man working an audience. Something quieter than all of that. Something that felt impossibly like recognition. He extended his hand. She stared at it for one full breath. His shadow flames curled at his knuckles, moving gently, and she could not help thinking that she should be afraid of them. Every story she had ever read said to be afraid of them. Every archivist's account described them as the most destructive force the pack had ever produced. A king who could not be touched without burning the thing that touched him. She took his hand anyway. The flames did not burn her. They wrapped around her fingers like warmth, finding somewhere it had been looking for, and the entire hall made a sound, not words, not laughter, just a collective intake of breath so sharp and simultaneous it felt like the room itself had flinched. Giovanni's voice was low. It was not loud. It did not need to be. You were never meant for him. He said it to her, not to the room, but the room heard every word. And Alessia, still not fully on her feet, still with cold stone under her and her best dress wrinkled at the knee, and the memory of the pack's laughter still echoing somewhere behind her sternum, felt something shift in the air around her. The way a room feels different the moment before lightning actually strikes. She did not know what was coming. But she held his hand, and his flames stayed warm and quiet against her skin. And for the first time in a very long time, nothing in her wanted to apologize for existing. The Alpha's brother rejected her in public. Then the king claimed her as his Luna. Chapter 2. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her back in the small room she had occupied since childhood, staring at the ceiling, listening to the palace settle around her, the groan of old timber, the distant sound of wind finding gaps in the stone, the occasional echo of boots in a corridor somewhere below. The sounds had never bothered her before. Tonight they felt like the palace itself was restless, turning something over, unable to get comfortable. She understood the feeling. She pressed one hand flat against her sternum, the way she always did when her thoughts became too loud for her chest to hold quietly. She could still feel it, the warmth of Giovanni's shadow flames against her fingers, not the burn she had braced for, not the searing, consuming heat that every account, every manuscript, every whispered warning in the pack had prepared her for. Just warmth. Steady and deep, like sunlight that had been stored somewhere and was only now being released. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself twice. By morning, the council had already convened. She found out the way she found out most things, not because anyone told her directly, but because she was quiet enough and unimportant enough that people spoke freely around her. A pair of senior elders passed her in the east corridor while she was carrying a stack of returned documents to the archive, and they did not lower their voices because she was, to them, furniture. Francesca brought 3 witnesses and a set of bloodline records, one of them said. Ancient lineage, cursed line, if the documents hold. They will hold, the other one said flatly. She had them prepared weeks ago. Alessia kept walking. She kept her face still and her steps even, and she did not let herself react until she had turned the corner and pressed her back against the wall and stood there for a moment with the documents clutched against her chest and her breath moving shallower than usual. Weeks ago, Lady Francesca had prepared documents to destroy her bloodline reputation weeks ago, before the ceremony, before the rejection, before any of last night had happened. Which meant last night had not been a surprise to everyone the way it had been a surprise to her. She made it to the archive. She set the documents down carefully, because they were old and not her feelings, and they deserved to be set down carefully. She stood at her father's work table and looked at the familiar disorder of it, the stacked manuscripts, the magnifying glass on its worn leather pad, the small clay cup he always kept near the edge with 2 or 3 sharpened quills in it, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she had just overheard. Then she heard her name. Not her title, not her family name, just Alesha, spoken in a low voice from the archive doorway, with the kind of quiet that meant the speaker was being careful not to startle her. She turned around. King Giovanni stood in the doorway of her archive. Not the ceremonial hall version of him, not framed by torchlight and collective terror, not moving through a crowd that parted like water. Just a man standing in a doorway, broader than the frame comfortably accommodated, his shadow flames dampened down to almost nothing, just faint traces of dark at his knuckles the way embers look when a fire has been deliberately banked. He was not wearing formal dress. He was wearing dark, plain clothing, and he looked like someone who had also not slept. He did not step inside without her permission. He waited. She noticed that. She filed it away somewhere. "Your father told me you would be here," he said. "My father knows you." The words came out more direct than she intended. She did not apologize for them. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that he was keeping in check. "Your father has been working with me for 7 months," he said. "He did not tell you." It was not a question. He already knew the answer. Alesha turned that over. 7 months. Her father, who told her everything, or she had believed he told her everything, had been meeting privately with the Alpha King for 7 months and had not said a single word about it. She thought about the late nights he had started keeping. The new manuscripts he had been requesting from the restricted archive levels, the ones she needed a senior signature to access. She had assumed he was deep in a research project. He was always deep in research projects. She had not thought to ask which one. "Come in," she said, because the alternative was having this conversation in a doorway, and she was too tired for that kind of positioning. He entered the archive and moved to the work table the way someone moves through a space they have visited before, not with the careful uncertainty of a stranger, but not with ownership either, with a kind of earned familiarity. He picked up nothing. He touched nothing. He simply stood on the other side of the table from her and looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her on the ceremonial hall floor, like she was the specific thing he had come to see, and everything else was background. "The council convened this morning," she said. "I know. Francesca has documents, bloodline records. They are saying my lineage carries a curse." She said it plainly, the way she said most difficult things, not dramatically, not with a crack in her voice, just put it down on the table between them and let it be what it was. She prepared them weeks before the ceremony. "I know that too," he paused. "The documents are fabricated." She stared at him. "You know that." "Your father discovered the original lineage records 3 months ago, during our translation work. Your bloodline is not cursed, Alesha. It is the opposite of cursed." He said it carefully, like a man placing something fragile on a surface and watching to make sure it holds. "That is what I need to explain to you. That is why I am here." She pulled out the chair at her father's work table and sat down in it, because her legs were making a quiet argument for that, and she decided to listen to them. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "Then explain," she said. He sat across from her. He reached into the inside of his jacket and drew out a folded piece of manuscript paper. Old, the edges softened with handling, the kind of aged that meant decades rather than years. He laid it flat on the table between them and turned it so she could read it. She leaned forward. The script was old dialect, 2 generations back at minimum, the kind she had spent years learning to read because her father believed that if a text existed, it deserved to be understood. She read it slowly, her lips barely moving the way they did when she was translating carefully. And as she read, something in her chest began to feel very strange. Not painful, not frightening, just strange. The way a room feels when you open a window you had not realized was sealed. The text described a wolf born without elemental aura. Born empty, it said, not as an insult, but as a specification. The way an empty vessel is not broken. It is made to hold something. The text said this wolf would appear once in an age, born into a pack that would not understand her, and she would be dismissed and overlooked and considered defective right up until the moment she was needed. It said her emptiness was not absence. It was capacity. It said she was designed, that specific word, designed, to receive and contain a specific kind of power. The kind that had no ceiling. The kind that, without her, would eventually destroy everything it touched. Alessia stopped reading. She looked up at Giovanni. His shadow flames had moved while she was reading. They were no longer banked and dim. They had risen slightly, curling at his forearms with a slow, restless energy, and as she looked at them directly, she realized they were not moving toward her. They were moving in her direction, not aggressively. The way a compass needle moves not by choice, but because it cannot help it, because that is what it is built to do. "Your flames," she said slowly, "in the ceremonial hall when you took my hand." "They went quiet," he said. For the first time in 11 years, they went completely quiet. He said it without drama, without performance, just as a fact that clearly still surprised him. "I have burned stone walls when I was angry. I have scorched the floor of my own throne room in my sleep. I have not been able to touch another living thing without—" He stopped. He started again. "When I held your hand, there was nothing. There was warmth, and there was quiet, and I felt something in my own chest settle that has not settled since I came into this power." The archive was very quiet around them. Dust moved in the window light. The manuscripts stood in their rows, patient and unreadable from a distance. "Your father and I were not just translating history," Giovanni continued. "We were looking for you. The texts call you the solar Luna, the one wolf in a generation built to absorb a king's raw celestial energy, the only creature capable of keeping that energy from becoming catastrophic." He held her gaze. "I did not come to the ceremony last night by accident. I came because your father had found the final confirmation in the ancestral texts 2 days before. I came because the bond described in those texts, a true fated mate bond older than any elemental classification system this pack uses, was pointing me to you, and had been pointing me to you for a very long time." Alessia sat with that. She sat with all of it, the fabricated bloodline curse, her father's 7 months of secret research, the shadow flames that had not burned her, the text on the table in front of her that described her emptiness as a design feature rather than a defect. She sat with the fact that Matteo had shoved her onto a stone floor in front of her entire pack, and that 30 seconds later the most feared king in the territory had stepped down from his throne and extended his hand to her, and she had taken it, and nothing had burned. She thought about Lady Bianca's voice, sweet on the surface, poisonous underneath. She thought about all the full moon nights as a child, standing barefoot in the grass with her eyes closed, waiting to feel something in her hands that never came. She thought about every manuscript she had ever read in this archive, every late night, every moment she had swallowed an insult and gone back to organizing a shelf. She thought about how none of that had been weakness. She had been becoming something, this whole time, that no one around her had had the vocabulary to recognize. She pressed her fingers to the edge of the manuscript on the table. Carefully, the way she always handled old documents, and she looked at Giovanni across her father's worktable in the quiet of the archive that smelled like cedar and aged paper and the oil her father used on the old bindings. "You said the bond was pointing you to me for a long time," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "How long?" He did not look away from her. "Since before I knew what it was," he said. "Since the first time I heard your father mention the archivist's daughter who could read old dialect without being taught it." A pause. "I thought it was curiosity. I was wrong about what it was." From somewhere on the other side of the palace, she heard the distant sound of raised voices. Not close, not immediate, but moving in the way that council arguments move when they are building toward something. Francesca, most likely. The forged documents, the push for annulment, the machinery of people who had decided the outcome they wanted and were now working backward to manufacture the justification. She heard it, and she did not flinch. She looked at the manuscript under her fingers, and she looked at the shadow flames curling quietly at Giovanni's hands, turning, she now noticed, almost imperceptibly toward her, the way a plant turns toward a light source it has no choice but to follow, and she felt something move in the deepest, quietest part of herself. Not her wolf rising, not power surging, not anything cinematic or loud. Just the sensation of a window opening in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. A breath of something coming in. Something that had been on the other side of the glass for years, patient and waiting, and was only now beginning to understand that the way in was not locked. It was simply not yet open. She lifted her hand from the manuscript and set it flat on the table and looked at the man across from her. The man whose flames stayed quiet in her presence. The man who had come looking for her before he knew her name. The man who had stepped off a throne without hesitation and offered his hand to a girl on a stone floor in front of an entire pack that was laughing at her. "Tell me the rest," she said. And he did. The Alpha's brother rejected her in public. Then the king claimed her as his Luna. Chapter 3. The eclipse came without warning. That was the thing nobody had accounted for. Not the council, not Francesca with her forged documents and her carefully prepared arguments, not even Giovanni's most senior advisors who tracked celestial patterns for a living. The astronomical charts had placed the solar eclipse 3 days out, but the sky did not consult the charts. The darkness came midday, sliding across the sun like a hand closing over a candle flame, and it came fast. Alessia was in the corridor, outside the east wing, when the light changed. She stopped walking. She looked up at the high window at the end of the passage, where pale midday sun had been streaming through the glass in a long rectangle on the floor, and she watched that rectangle shrink and dim and go gray in the span of about 30 seconds. The corridor temperature dropped. Somewhere deep in the palace, a door slammed as wind found an opening it had not been able to reach before. Then she heard Giovanni. Not his voice, not words. A sound that was not quite human, not quite animal, somewhere between the two, coming from the direction of the great hall. And underneath it, a low, resonant crack, like stone finding its limit. She ran. She had never been a fighter. She had no elemental aura, no trained combat skill, no weapon at her belt. She was an archivist's daughter in a corridor with ink-stained fingers and soft-soled shoes, and she ran toward the sound anyway, because something in the deepest part of her, that quiet, patient thing that had been pressing against the inside of her chest since Giovanni first touched her hand, told her to move, and she had learned in the last 2 days to start listening to it. She pushed through the great hall doors. The room was already clearing. Pack members were pressing toward the exits, some walking fast, some running outright, a few of the children being carried. The torches on the walls had gone out. The only light in the hall came from Giovanni himself, not warmth, not gold, but deep churning shadow light, the kind that seems to pull illumination inward rather than cast it outward. His shadow flames were not curling at his knuckles anymore. They were everywhere. Climbing his forearms, wrapping his shoulders, flooding across the floor around his feet in slow, dark waves that scorched the stone black wherever they touched. He was on his knees. That was the thing that hit her first. Not the flames, not the darkness or the cracked floor or the temperature that had dropped so sharply she could see her own breath. The king was on his knees with both fists pressed to the ground and his head down, and every muscle in his body was rigid with the effort of holding something back. The stone under his hands had split in a jagged line. The wall nearest him had a scorch mark running floor to ceiling that had not been there that morning. He was losing. She did not think after that. Thinking was too slow. She walked into the flames. Later, she would not be able to explain what made her certain she would not burn. It was not bravery exactly, because bravery implies you weigh the risk and choose to move anyway. She did not weigh anything. She simply knew, the way she knew the old dialect script by feel before her eyes fully processed the letters, the way she knew the smell of rain before the first drop arrived. Her body knew something her mind had not yet caught up to, and her body moved. The shadow flames touched her first at her ankles. They did not burn. They did what they had done in the ceremonial hall when Giovanni took her hand. They went quiet. Not out, not extinguished, but quieted, like a sound dropping below the frequency of pain into something bearable. She felt them move up her legs and across her arms as she walked deeper into the radius of his power, and every place they touched, they stilled. She reached him, and she dropped to her knees in front of him on the scorched stone, and she put both her hands on either side of his face, and she made him look at her. His eyes were wild. They were the eyes of a man fighting something inside his own skin, losing ground by the second, terrified in a way that had nothing to do with external threat and everything to do with the specific horror of being unable to trust yourself. She recognized that look. She had worn a quieter version of it every day for most of her life. "Look at me," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was still proud of it for that. "Giovanni, look at me, not at the fire, look at me." His jaw was clenched so hard she could see it in the line of his neck. His hands on the floor were shaking. The shadow flames between them moved restlessly, drawn toward her and then drawn back, like they were trying to decide. "I cannot hold it," he said through his teeth. "Alesha, you need to leave this room." "I am not leaving," she said. "It will consume." "It will not." She pressed her palms more firmly against his face. "It has not burned me yet. It is not going to burn me. Look at your flames, Giovanni. Look at what they do when I am near them." He looked. The shadow flames closest to her hands had gone almost completely still. They were moving differently in her proximity, slower, softer at the edges, less like wildfire and more like smoke after a fire has been brought under control. He stared at them, chest heaving, and something shifted in his face. Not relief yet, just the beginning of believing that relief might be possible. That was the moment it happened. It started in her chest, a heat that was nothing like pain, a brightness that had no color she had ever seen before because it was coming from inside her, rather than from any external source. It moved outward from her sternum, the way heat moves from a fire you have banked all night that finally catches the wood it has been working on for hours. It moved through her shoulders, down her arms, into her palms where they pressed against Giovanni's face, and she felt his shadow flames respond to it immediately. The way iron responds to a magnet, not with resistance, but with an almost helpless recognition. The light that came out of her was gold and white, and something in between that she had no name for. It filled the hall. Not explosively, not in the way the shadow flames had been consuming the space, not with violence or chaos. The light came out of Alesha like a long breath after a long time of not being able to breathe fully. It expanded slowly, deliberately, and everywhere it touched Giovanni's shadow flames, it did not extinguish them. It absorbed them, drew them in the way a deep, still lake absorbs a stone, completely, without drama, without resistance, simply taking the disruption into itself and going calm. The scorch marks on the floor did not disappear, but the shadow flames retreated from them. The cracked stone under Giovanni's hands stopped spreading. The cold in the room lifted, degree by degree, and a different warmth replaced it, something that felt ancient and enormous and entirely hers. Giovanni looked at her. His flames were gone, not suppressed, not buried, gone, drawn entirely into the luminous space she had created around them both. His hands on the floor had stopped shaking. The wildness in his eyes had become something else, something that took her a moment to identify because she had not seen it directed at her before. It was awe, clean, uncomplicated, absolute. She was still glowing. She could feel it not uncomfortably the way too much sunlight is uncomfortable, but naturally the way your own body heat is natural. It was hers. It had always been hers. It had been waiting the way the manuscript had described for the right conditions, for the right catalyst, for him. She became aware, gradually, that they were no longer alone in the hall. People had stopped in the doorways. Pack members who had been fleeing had turned back when the shadow flames began to recede. The elders who had convened with Francesca that morning were standing in a cluster near the main entrance, their formal council robes making them easy to identify even in the strange new light. Francesca herself was there, near the front, and Alesha looked at her directly for the first time that morning and watched the color drain from her face in real time. And then there was Matteo. He was standing apart from the council, apart from everyone, at the far edge of the hall. He was not moving. He was looking at Alesha with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the cold deliberateness of the ceremonial hall, not the performative ease he wore like a second skin in public. Something stripped of all of that. Something that looked, from this distance, very much like a man watching a door close on something he had not understood the value of, until the precise moment it was no longer his. She felt nothing cruel about it. She felt nothing triumphant. She just looked at him for a moment, briefly, the way you look at a chapter of your life that is finished, and then she looked away. Giovanni rose from his knees. He moved with the steadiness of a man who has just had something restored to him that he had spent years grieving, and he stood beside Alessia and faced the hall. Francesca found her voice first. It was shakier than usual. "This changes nothing," she said, and even as she said it, Alessia could hear the wobble underneath the firmness, the place where the certainty had been and was no longer. The lineage records still stand. A wolf without documented elemental classification cannot legally. "She has a classification," Giovanni said. His voice was quiet. It was the quietest voice in the room, and it filled every corner of it. He reached into his jacket and drew out the folded manuscript, the same one he had placed on the archive table that morning, the one Alessia had read with her fingers trailing the old dialect script, and felt something unlock inside her. He held it up, not as a threat, just as a fact. "Solar Luna," he said, "documented in the ancestral texts your council has had access to for 3 generations and chose not to read." He looked at the elders specifically when he said that last part. "Her father can provide the full translation. The original texts are in the restricted archive. The seals are intact. They have not been touched since they were catalogued, which means no one fabricated them, which means they say exactly what they say." The hall was very quiet. Francesca looked at the manuscript. She looked at Alessia, still luminous, the solar light moving gently around her like warm water. She looked at the scorch marks on the floor where the king's uncontrolled flames had been, and at the fact that those flames were simply gone, not suppressed, not driven back, absorbed, taken in, neutralized by the girl she had spent weeks engineering the destruction of. She had nothing left. Alessia could see the moment Francesca understood that. It moved across her face like weather. One of the senior elders, the one who had been most vocal in the council chamber, the one Alessia had overheard in the east corridor that morning, took one step backward. Then he lowered himself to one knee, not gracefully, not with the practiced ease of formal ceremony. He went down the way people go down when something much larger than their pride makes the decision for them. The others followed, not all at once, one by one with varying degrees of resistance, but they all got there. The council elders in their formal robes, kneeling on scorched stone in the great hall, in front of an archivist's daughter who smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, and was currently glowing with the most ancient elemental power any of them had ever seen in their lifetimes. Francesca did not kneel. She stood very still, and then she turned and walked toward the exit, and no one stopped her, and Giovanni let her go, because the kind of defeat she was carrying out of that room was already its own sentence. Then there was the matter of Matteo. Giovanni did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke Matteo's name once, into the silence of the kneeling hall, and the single word carried the full weight of a king who has been patient for a very long time and has now reached the end of that patience. Matteo walked forward. He stopped a few feet away. He did not look at Giovanni. He looked at Alessia, and she let him look because she was not afraid of him anymore, and she was not angry at him anymore, and the absence of both of those things felt like putting down something she had been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it was. "I was blackmailed," Matteo said. His voice was low. He was not performing for anyone. "Francesca had documents she threatened to use against our family. I thought—" He stopped. He tried again. "I thought I was making the only choice I had." "You had another choice," Giovanni said. Matteo's jaw moved. He did not argue. "You chose the title," Giovanni said, "and you chose it at the cost of her." He did not say it with rage. He said it with the flat, final clarity of a man stating a recorded fact. That choice carries a consequence. The exile was pronounced quietly. Permanent. Outer fringes, beyond the Pack's territory, beyond the reach of the Pack's protection or resources. No ceremony around it. No drama. Just a sentence delivered in the same tone you might use to close an account that is no longer active. Matteo looked at Alessia one more time before he turned to leave. She thought he might say something. He did not. He just looked, and then he looked away, and then he walked out of the great hall, and she watched him go, and she felt the door close. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just closed. Giovanni turned to her when Matteo was gone. Just to her, the way he had in the ceremonial hall, the way he had in the archive that morning. Like the rest of the room was background, and she was the specific thing he had come to find. His shadow flames were gone. His hands were still. She was still holding her light, feeling it move quietly through her like a current that had finally found the right channel, no longer backing up, no longer building pressure with nowhere to go. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was such a simple question. After everything, the eclipse, the wildfire, the kneeling elders, the exile, the years of standing at the outer edge of rooms that did not want her, he asked her if she was all right, and he asked it the way her father asked it, the way someone asks when they actually want to know the answer. She considered the question honestly. Her knee still hurt faintly from the stone floor of the ceremonial hall the night before. Her dress was the same cream-colored one she had worn to a ceremony where someone had shoved her to the ground in front of everyone she knew, and it had a scorch mark near the hem now from the floor of this hall. She was glowing with a power she did not yet fully understand, in a palace that had not known what to do with her 24 hours ago, and would be spending the next several months figuring out how to reckon with what she was now. She was also, for the first time in her life, exactly where she was supposed to be. "Yes," she said. She meant it. Giovanni's shadow flames returned slowly, the way they always did, rising at his knuckles, curling at his forearms, the dark and restless energy that had governed his entire reign and burned through everything that had ever come close to it. They rose and they found her light immediately, and they did what they always did in her presence. They quieted. They turned toward her. They settled. She looked at them, and she did not look away. The hall was still full of kneeling people. The scorched floor was still scorched. The eclipse outside was passing, thin light beginning to return through the high windows in pale, cautious lines. There was a great deal of work ahead, the forged documents to formally disprove, the council to restructure, her father to find and probably embrace until he apologized for 7 months of secrets. There was a title she did not fully have words for yet, and a bond older than the Pack's founding stones, and a king whose destructive power her soul had apparently been designed to hold since before either of them was born. There was a great deal ahead. She looked at the light coming back through the high windows, and she felt her own light still moving through her, warm and enormous and entirely hers, and she thought about the full moon nights as a child, standing barefoot in the grass, waiting to feel something in her hands. She had been waiting for this. She just had not known what this was yet. She looked at Giovanni beside her, his shadow flames quiet, his hands still, his eyes on her with that same expression she had identified in the ceremonial hall. Not pity, not performance, not the calculated warmth of a man working a room. Recognition. The specific, irreversible recognition of someone finding the thing they did not have a name for until they were standing in front of it. She reached out and took his hand. His flames wrapped around her fingers, warm and quiet, the way they had the first time. The way she understood now they always would. The Pack bowed. The light came back through the windows. And Alessia, Archivist's daughter, the girl who had been told her whole life that her silence meant she had nothing, stood in the center of all of it, glowing, held, and completely, finally, found.